Wow. So, welcome everyone to the Non-Human Rights Critical Perspectives book launch. It's great to see colleagues, friends, students as well. So thank you for joining us. Also, it's great to have some people online. So thank you. We're going to speak about the book, of course, as you might expect. And we will try to convince you to buy a copy of the book. And we know that the book is a bit expensive. First editions are quite expensive nowadays. We don't want you to sell a kidney to buy a copy. So we have a flyer with a 35% discount. So if you are interested in the book after this presentation, you are very welcome to use this flyer, which is, this flyer. And so I will give a brief introduction to the book. We'll speak about the theoretical framework in which this book, which this project has developed, and also about some of the drivers. So I will go over some of the things that I already said in the written introduction. So if you read it, sorry for the repetition, but I think that it's important to highlight some of these issues, because they speak about the scope of this project and this book. So after that, Costas will also speak about the book in general, and Marie will speak about her contribution to the volume. And after all that, we'll have some time for questions. And after that, we have an amazing wine reception waiting for us. So, yeah. Okay. So, over the last few years, we have witnessed an exponential growth of the recognition of non-human rights or legal susceptibility to non-human beings. So very probably you have noted or seen in news outlets from time to time a piece of legislation or a judgment about the extension of rights to non-humans. I think gradually non-human rights are becoming part of our ordinary landscape and ordinary legal vocabulary. What started as a marginal thing, as marginal cases at the local or even municipal level in some countries, now expanded globally, and different countries around the world, such as Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, but also India, Bangladesh, New Zealand, the US, the United States at the municipal level, Spain here in Europe, and many more countries recognize rights and legal personhood to non-human entities. So this volume attempts to understand this global phenomenon. Interestingly, this search in rights for non-humans has also coincided with a growing uncertainty about the future of human rights. Human rights seems to be suffering from an existential crisis, as critical appraisals in the scholarship have evinced from some time now, and as the behavior of some states at the international level also show. So the question then is how to explain this dual trajectory of the discourse of rights. How to explain, or how can we understand these circumstances which shows on the one hand the rise of non-human rights, and on the other the decline of human rights. How can we understand these circumstances which shows both the vitality an extension of the rights rhetoric, as well as its agony and contraction. So is the expansion of rights to non-humans an outcome of the twilight of human rights, or something that happens despite this apparent decline of human rights? So these contradictory tendencies that we can see at the level of the rights discourse, we can also see it at the level of non-human rights. These contradictory tendencies, for example, can be seen on how the scholarship have taken this non-human term in the law. So non-human rights have been met both with enthusiasm and derision. They have been considered both revolutionary, a kind of paradigm shift, but also not radical enough to face the contemporary challenges that we have. Some see in non-human rights at the centering of the human, others a form of veiled anthropocentrism. Some people think non-human rights are a useful juridical fiction, while others believe they represent a timely acknowledgement of non-humans' inherent characteristics, such as sentiency or intelligence. Non-human rights have been considered a kind of recognition of indigenous non-Western beliefs, ontologies, and epistemes, as well as a cultural appropriation of indigenous practices, a straitjacket to the worldviews of indigenous peoples, or not sufficiently decolonizing, or a new tool for neocolonialism. So while some have considered non-human rights a form or a way of protecting non-humans from exploitation and a potential means to confront the worst aspects of capitalism, others have seen in them a form of masking extractivism and neoliberal policies or neoliberal practices. Some assert that non-human rights are a renewed nonsense upon stilts, clearly, quoting Jeremy Bentham's famous characterization of the rights of man in the 19th century. Others believe that non-human rights are the step forward that the law must take to keep pace with the times, whether these times are seen as the age of the intrusion of Gaia, the transhumanist age of the singularity, the Anthropocene, and all its multiple variants, or simply the end of the world, as Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro put it so well. So in most cases, it is difficult to assert which of these opposing accounts about non-human rights is valid. It is as if non-human rights were a bit of both. It is as if non-human rights were strained by the new trying to emerge and the old refusing to let go. So as can be anticipated from these questions that we present in this volume, the book proposes a somewhat different approach to the study of non-human rights. The volume is not advocacy-oriented, it's not focused on litigation, it's not focused on doctrine, it's theoretically oriented. Moreover, far from an exacerbated optimism that we can see in some other works, this volume attempts to cast a critical light on this trend on non-human rights' rapid emergence and how this trend has gradually shaped how we perceive, understand, and engage with non-humans in the law. So the book presents three strands together, and this is part of the originality of this contribution. It presents three strands together that are usually styled separately. These are animal rights, the rights for nature, and machine or robot rights. The book's particular focus assumes that animal rights, nature rights, and robot rights are discursively connected and must be analyzed in tandem as part of the same phenomenon. While we can distinguish historical emergence of these different trends, we also have to acknowledge that they share some ideological assumptions, political and legal imaginaries, discursive justifications, and also a core of common tenets, goals, and ideals. So the reason for this is that these three trends respond to the same set of concerns and motivations revolving around the technological revolution that we are experiencing nowadays, on the one hand, and the impact that this technological revolution has had on the environment and the habitability on the planet on the other. Human rights make sense and are explicable in what Peter Frey has called the two specters that haunt the 21st century, that is, ecological catastrophe on the one hand and automation on the other. So it could be said that if human rights were the ideology at the end of history, epitomized by the fall of the Soviet Union and the triumph of capitalism, as Kostas Dousinas said very well in The End of Human Rights, we can say so. We can also say today that non-human rights could be characterized as the ideology at the end of the world, epitomized by the devastating effects of the technical revolution on the ecological milieu. So, a disclaimer. We are aware that by using the term non-human in the title and, across or throughout the book, we risk verifying a problematic category with no empirical correlation, as it happens with other concepts like non-white or non-European or non-Western. The term non-human establishes its field of semantic application based upon an opposition, in this case with the human, and relies on a purely negative definition. These problems are not necessarily prevented or averted by using other expressions of the like, such as more than human or other than human, that are also very common in the literature, as these terms also work by reference to the human. So it could be said that all these descriptors are ideologically loaded, so they are not neutral, as only from the point of view of the human can other entities be described as non-human, more than human, or other than human. And this is clear as these are not unavoidable descriptors. There are other ways through which we can refer to the beings or the entities in question. So, for example, we can speak of species, habitat, constitution, inorganic, organic, and so on. So the human-no-human opposition seems even more inadequate today, as this opposition does not help to organize and understand the multiplicity of human and non-human assemblages that technology has made possible. So from creatures created by engineering using both human and animal cells, to transgenic seeds and bacteria produced by humans in laboratories, drones and robots programmed to adopt human or animal behavior, xenobots created by humans that act like organic machines, and the cyber quality of human bodies enhanced by different technologies such as this. Human and non-human existence seems to blur in our societies, sometimes becoming utterly indistinguishable. Now, the term non-human both includes and excludes the non-human in relation to the human. This is thus a mechanism of inclusion through exclusion. And it is precisely because of this that we, the editors, have decided to keep the term non-human as this volume common denominator. Some of the contributors might disagree with us, but we believe that despite all the shortcomings, the term is useful to designate an ontological realm or an ontological space to which those who are not regarded as human are cast. It serves to identify the locus and the circumstances that non-humans, and also some humans considered less than human or inhuman, inhabit. The usefulness of the descriptor then lies in that it encapsulates the phenomenon of inclusion-exclusion, making it visible and graspable. Non-human thus designates both a state of being and an ontoepistemological operation through which this state of being is generated and assigned to certain forms of existence, constituting a form of existing in the world. Another reason to keep this term is that the expression non-human rights can be understood in different ways, reflecting the tension existing between opposing views in this field. So on the one hand, this expression indicates the rights of animals, nature, AI, and so on. This is how the literature has used the term. However, without the hyphen, removing the hyphen in the term non-human, we can refer to what are not human rights. So while the former, the non-human with the hyphen, designates the rights of non-humans, an extension of human rights to non-humans, the latter, that is non-humans without the hyphen, points towards something different from human rights. Which of these variations of non-human rights will prevail remains to be seen. If it is true that a quick overview indicates that in most cases, in most legislation and in case law, we just witness an extension of human rights to non-humans, as also some of the chapters in the book demonstrates well, it is not less right that non-human rights also offer an opportunity to think beyond human rights. So the ambiguity of the expression non-human rights invite us to be playful with the words and to look at this beyond. This volume, and with this I finish. I promised a short introduction, but I think that it wasn't that short. So this volume aims to advance our knowledge about the changing patterns of the rights discourse in contemporary societies marked by rapid technological changes and the fast degradation of the environment. The chapters that this collective volume gathers explore the non-human term in the law critically and interdisciplinary. And most of them draw and take inspiration from a broader shift in the humanities and social sciences, ranging from the ontological term in anthropology, new materialisms, post-human feminisms, actor network theory, but also other approaches informed by the colonial thinking, phenomenology, indigenous scholarship, and critical animal studies. So drawing on these and other perspectives, the authors of this volume provide a rich and ample overview of what non-human rights are today and how we can engage, sometimes even sympathize with them, with non-human rights, without lowering our critical threshold. So we leave it there. Thank you so much for listening and for your patience. I will hand over to Costas, I think, who might want to say a few more words about, who just arrived, who might want to, come here, please. Next to Marie, here.
I do apologize, but my lane tube was closed for some reason, and then I got a cab and so the city was dreadful. Okay, hello everyone. Speaking about a collection of essays, a compendium, a kind of medley of essays, job was very difficult because quite often are not particularly related to one another. And indeed, when you didn't have a conference that ended up in a collection, that makes it even harder. And yet, looking at this particular collection, because I'm going to speak not so much as an author, but as someone who tries to review this book, there is a certain order that emerges. And to trace this order, I used a bit of AI logic with this lovely idea of non-human with a hyphen and without a hyphen. And I have, I think, worked out a number of binary oppositions. Okay, let me mention a few that I'm going to talk about. Human, non-human. Rights, non-rights. Rights, human rights. Persons, non-persons. Finally, human rights, non-human rights. Alexis has spoken about all this stuff towards the end when I came here, and I should immediately say that, of course, this is a book of Alexis. I'm more or less a free rider. So I think that I want to make clear from the beginning. So let me go through these binary oppositions, these negativities. Human, non-human. Let me start with the human. Pre-modern societies did not know a human species. Free men were Athenians and Spartans, Romans and Carthaginians, but they were not humans. Indeed, the term humanitas appears for the first time in the Roman Republic, and it is being defined as eruditio et institutio in bonus artes. In other words, sort of the educated Romans who'd been to Oxford and so on were homines humani. The human was an epithet, was an adjective, and it was distinguished from the homines barbari, everyone else, so the non-Roman citizens of the Republic. The first proper universalist use of humanitas in the Western tradition, of course, is the Christian idea that we can all be saved in God's plan of salvation, of course, if we convert. If you convert, then the universal humanity will save you. And of course, this idea of conversion is the first big ideological foundation of conquest, of empire, of colonialism, and so on. So it is the civilizing mission in with the human. What happens with the non-human? Now, two types of debates emerged in the discussion after the conquest, and Oscar has written extensively about that. One was the famous debate in Valladolid, but not just that. Two kinds of positions emerged about the non-humans that had been discovered after the conquest. One side was that the non-human is the inhuman, the racially inferior, irrational, cruel, victimizing, and that characteristic justified enslavement, atrocities, even annihilation. Today, this kind of attitude exists in relation to the axis of evil, the rogue states, the bogus refugees, the invader migrants. At the other end, the non-human was treated as the childhood of humanity, ourselves in nations, and therefore the strategies were strategies of development, of spiritual or material development, of progress. Let them make those people like us. Let us help them to grow up. So the non-human is the inhuman, the contradiction of the human, because human and inhuman in that first narrative are mutually exhaustive. But in logic, there is a second type of negativity, which is called contrariety. Contradiction is two terms which are mutually exclusive. Contrariety refers to two terms which are incompatible, but they are not mutually exhaustive. So contradiction is black, not black. Contrariety is black, white. So why the first attitude turns the non-human into the inhuman, a contradiction, a totally exhaustive contradiction between the two terms? If we turn to contrariety, to the second type of non-human, we have here the humanity of humanism and of the academic humanities, which unites the subject who knows, we civilized Westerners, and the non-object as a matter of self-reflection. We examine our cultural products, our Shakespeare's and our Rembrandts and our Beethovens in order to understand ourselves, our own identity. But if we turn to the corresponding term for human in Greek, which is anthropos, the term anthropos has a very interesting characteristic. It is not universalizing. You do not have a humanity coming out of anthropos. And if you look at the epistemology using the term anthropos, you have physical and social anthropology. Physical anthropology examining the body, the senses, the emotions. Social anthropology examining, at least up until about 20 or 30 years ago, the diverse non-Western people and cultures who emerged through conquest and colonization. In other words, humanity and anthropos, the Roman and the Greek, signify two asymmetrical ontologies and epistemologies. Humanity is civilization, anthropos is outside or beyond civilization. The human is universal, the anthropos is particular. Now, I argued that the inhuman is a normative creation of the human, its contradiction. Now, several authors, turning to the book in this volume, argue that what I would call anthropic entities, in other words, non-human entities which are totally other than human, but not inhuman. So anthropic entities and anthropic laws exist or ought to exist as contrarieties, as that kind of opposition to the human. One author argues that the human should be replaced by creaturely rights, the rights of creatures, the condition of being a dog. Another, that animals are bearers of legal meaning, but not of legal rights. Court cases that have been discussed extensively have decided that higher apes and natural zones are legal, but not human persons. The references to the European adoption of indigenous cosmologies with entangled relationalities, the work here for Marie, point again to what I would call anthropic legalities, with the evident risk, of course, that Marie refers to, of a new kind of indigenous Orientalism. We could call it an indigenous orientation. Alain Potage argues, who is not with us, that the use of anthropic entities and anthropic laws, as I define them anthropic, because this is a neologism that I create, can lead to even more extensive capitalist exploitation. Let me turn to rights and non-rights and the associated person and non-person. Sometimes we have to go to the moon in order to see and understand what's happening next to us. So here, this book is about animal rights, about nature rights, about robot rights, but mostly it is a history and theory of the person, from Plato to Nato, with Alexis's wonderful chapter being the most complete history of the person. So we all accept, everyone accepts in the book, that the person starts as a theatrical mask, then it becomes a legal mask in Rome, a mask imposed upon a human person or about someone by the law. Since Rome, a person is an entity that has rights, and rights belong to person. Something that Hegel, for example, made a very big issue about. Rights belong to persons, persons are entities that have rights. But the homo, the physical human being, and the person were and are separate. Many hominids are non-persons, and many persons are not humans. Today, however, we're all persons, because we all have freedom, will, reason, or the rest of it. How come that we came to this kind of approach today, universalist approach, starting with a legal person that was clearly a creation of man? A formidable feat of transubstantiation started when medieval theology extravagantly gave God three phases or three aspects and called them persons: the Father, Son, and the human being. And of course, as we are, we human, the image and likeness of God, we became God's mirror image. rational, willing, free, omnipotent. The juridical persona, the Roman juridical persona, was united with the moral person to create the metaphysical person of our days. But is the legal person identical with the empirical human being today? Before the recent moral turn, the human rights turn of jurisprudence, it was very clear. From Austin to Kelsen, the person is a logical quilting point, a point, a personification of a bunch of legal and social relations. The person combines a patchwork of norms, rules, and relations, creating a concrete and different legal person for all of us. We are legal persons, and I'm a legal person because of the rights, duties, obligations, and so on that come together around myself, and the same to you, although that would be a different legal person for the next person. Now, of course, the metaphysical person, what I call the metaphysical person, come together with the legal person and the moral person, after shedding its Christian sackcloth, assumed the secular garments of Kantian dignity. And then, of course, will, morality, and life. So the persona, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, has two overlapping lives. Its everyday existence is in the annals of law, courts, and case reports. Its more exalted part is in church sermons, academic conferences like this, and political rhetoric. We're all humans and we all fight for your dignity and all the rest. The non-human here is the inhuman. It cannot be a legal person because legal person or the person combines law and morality. But the anthropic, the non-human who is the anthropic, the contrariety of the human, can be all kinds of things. Because the legal person remains a fiction created by the law, which is still separate from the human, distinct from and superimposed upon empirical selves. It is a cipher with no biological or psychological characteristics. It acquires in relation to each one of us, but not as the person generally. It is a two-dimensional caricature placed on the three-dimensional fullness of face and body. The answer to the question, who is a person and who is not a person, the answer to that is given by the law and politics and follows capitalist priorities. The abstraction and concreteness of personhood is an indispensable tool of the dominant socio-economic order. It is too flexible and too malleable to be abandoned to its moralistic alter ego. This brings us to the last opposition, human rights, non-human rights. And Alex said quite a few. Again, I'm going to follow that idea of the binary opposition, the contradiction, and the contrariety. The human of human rights is a marriage of convenience between the legal person and the universal personality of humanity. In a sense, it is a metaphysical person that I spoke about earlier in its full glory. Human rights co-opt the affective part of religion and post-theological metaphysics while claiming to be the most secular of institutions. Okay, the continuation. But human rights, and this is something that, I taught the first human rights course in this country at undergraduate level back in 1981. And I'm really so upset when I see what the textbooks say and what, people, including colleagues, teach when they teach human rights courses. The first thing they don't say is that human rights is a subcategory of legal rights. It's a subcategory. They're not the same thing. Legal rights were and still are the building block of modern capitalist law. Human rights emerged only in the late 20th century as a response to the Cold War and the obvious moral deficit of positivist law and rights, a moral deficit that became apparent after the war in the Nuremberg and other post-Nazi trials. Human rights started acquiring their current cachet only in the 1970s. Legal rights go back to Rome and early modernity. A 1978 bibliography of rights has next to no mention to human rights. John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, my great friends, had started developing a liberal jurisprudence of legal rights with no reference to human rights. And then, without missing a beat, they renamed rights into human rights in the 1980s. Dworkin is characteristic. He was asked by Columbia to give a talk on human rights. He took a lecture he'd given on rights and replaced rights with human rights, and there it was. Rights and human rights are the same thing, which helped very much philosophers, moral philosophers, to present rights as the main component of all morality and dismiss all other sources and resources of morality, and of course only rights is really moral. Now, can animals, the nature, and robots have rights and human rights? After the person's metaphysical metamorphosis I described earlier, two trajectories open. The first identifies the person with metaphysical humanity and insists that only humans can be legal persons. In the second, the legal person continues to work as the morally agnostic technology of recognition and separation. Non-human entities can have legal rights, but not human rights. And I think it is a category mistake if rights given either to corporations or to animals in nature and robots are called human rights. They are legal rights as they have been throughout the Western civilization. Law, uninterested in moral claims, can and has started giving limited personhood to animals and greenbelts, to androids and replicants. The anthropic, the post-human, is the revenge of the legal person against its metaphysical doppelganger. Now, what rights nature and robots ought to have? As I said, this is decided in the relevant entities' interaction with the economic and social system. There is nothing new about it. It is the logical extension of the constructive and constructive character of all legal personhood. The law can bestow limited or full legal personhood on nature and robots. Of course, this will not be the result of organized and social and political movements, particularly in relation to AI, as is the case with animals, where you have organized social and political movements pushing for recognition of animal rights, and to a certain extent with rights of nature. But AI and robots at the minute do not have a big movement pushing towards legal personhood. The law will extend legal entitlements and duties when it is practical or useful to do so. In other words, when the interests of capitalism demand it. The rights to be assigned will be decided on a case-by-case basis, as it has happened already in relation to animals, to nature, and to limited rights for AI entities, through a capitalist cost and benefit analysis. This is what Alain, Marie, and Alexis tell us, moving the debate from the semantics and metaphysics of the human to the materiality of economic interests. It's a fitting conclusion to a book that in reality it is a legal ontology of the human. Thanks.
Yeah, great. It's difficult to follow up these two acts, but let me start by thanking you, Alexi, for the efforts you've put in the publication of this book and in organizing this gathering to celebrate this event, to all of you in the room, and also to Gulsh, who's always here to help us with the organization of these events here at Queen Mary. So as Alexis and Kostas already mentioned, my chapter in the book looks at different theories of relationality that underpin the rights of nature movement. And of course, this movement is not a monolith. In many ways, there are as many understandings of rights of nature as there are local communities as well as transnational institutions that claim them. Now, each of these invocations of rights of nature rest on a particular theory of relationality, by which I mean a particular way of conceptualizing relations between humans and non-humans, either nature as a whole or atomistic parts, be it rivers, lagoons, forests, etc. And these different theories of relationality determine how claimants, activists, policymakers, legislators, adjudicators, etc., will envisage or imagine how to legally protect the non-human entities at stake. And so against this backdrop, my chapter starts by starts with a diagnosis that invocations of rights of nature in Western legal orders like the EU, which is the one that I focus on, but the same could be said about various UN agencies. Think of the UN Agenda on Living in Harmony with Nature, for example. These legal orders tend to explicitly draw inspiration from reconstitutional processes in Latin America, notably Ecuador and Bolivia, that recognized so-called nature as right holders. And when EU policymakers lean on Andean cosmologies to make their case for recognition of rights of nature in the EU, an essentialized indigeneity, as Kostas mentioned, tends to figure in these invocations to redeem, to salvage, to purify rights from the colonial and neoliberal developments. So in the chapter, I look into these issues by focusing on one recent or relatively recent policy framework, the proposed EU Charter on the Fundamental Rights of Nature that was drafted by a group of experts in 2019 and submitted to the European Economic and Social Committee for consideration. This EU Charter takes explicit inspiration from Ecuador and Bolivia, which in 2008 and 2009 respectively went through a process of reconstitutionalization. So moving from a monocultural and a mononatural state into plurinational and intercultural polities that constitutionally recognize dozens of indigenous nationalities and cultures as equal before the law and as ethnically diverse. And so this implied taking into account multiple forms of relating to so-called nature and legally acknowledge the existence of different socio-natural worlds. And so at stake in many ways was more a constitutional recognition of a relative or negotiated sovereignty or self-determination of indigenous, Afro-descendant, Maroon, and Native communities than an integration or a reckoning with these communities onto epistemologies as such. Yet to be made legible or translated into state law, these onto epistemologies had to be reduced to the liberal framework of rights. And as Alain powerfully argues in his chapter in the book, this did not interrupt the violent post-colonial conditions of development, including the centrality of the state, patterns of resource distribution, and social marginalizations. Indeed, while these recognitions might at local scales work as useful or powerful tactic to counter specific depredatory projects, give visibility to otherwise marginalized constituencies, and lend impetus to the development of more livable ecologies, the broader ambition and the strategy for interrupting the discourses, institutions, and practices that have, over the course of centuries, turned nature into a global standing reserve cannot be realized by rights of nature as currently imagined and configured at least. Now, in my chapter, I don't look at concrete practices of rights of nature to assess these implications for the communities and their ecologies. Instead, I look into the institutional metabolization of the rights of nature discourse within the EU. And I was interested in this translation process of rights of nature and its passage into an agnostic legal order, which both draws on Andean cosmologies and their mediation within the Ecuadorian and Bolivian constitutions, yet also tactically distantiates itself from these technologies. So how do EU experts walk this thin line between inspiration and essentialization, affirming, on the one hand, indigenous cosmologies, yet reducing them to governance templates for new becoming or relating differently in a world ravaged by ecological havoc? But the story that I tell is not, is not merely one of essentialized indigeneity. What I explore is how the theory of relationality that the EU Charter suggests differs from the one that underpins the Andean cosmologies that they invoke. So we are not in the realm, or we are not fully in the realm of cooptation or pure appropriation. The indigenous normativity that was partially translated into state law in the plurinational constitutions of Ecuador and of Bolivia, and which act as legitimizing sites for the EU Charter to call for rights of nature in the EU, proposes different and arguably colliding theories of relationality. So both of them work with different theories of relationalities. And so as the EU experts reckon, indeed, the Andean examples that they explicitly draw upon by referring, for example, to Article 71, 396, 397 of the Ecuadorian Constitution, they are defined, and here I quote from the EU Charter, as an expression of a cosmovision, and with the EU experts then contrasting this to the Charter itself, which they define as a common reality for the survival of a European generations, end quote. How these experts understand this cosmovision and contrast it from a common reality remains, of course, unclear, but this positioning speaks to the strategic distantiating that takes, again, distance from the Andean lived experience, shielding the experts from critiques of cooptation and appropriation. So instead, the experts try to tactically locate their proposal within a shared European mode of existence by providing an agnostic European grounding for the proposal and contrast it to the Andean worldviews that are, as the experts hold, deeply rooted in ancestral cultures that have not forgotten their original dependence on nature, end quote. Here again, this rootedness in ancestral cultures that foreground humans' original dependence on nature is further characterized by the EU experts as the chthonic legal traditions symbiotically linked to nature. Again, these chthonic legal traditions rest on theories of relationality that view humans as entangled within lively ecologies, or what in contemporary critique or contemporary critical theory is often referred to as vibrant or agential ontoepistemologies. These approaches reject the assumptions of Newtonian physics that see the world as made up of entities with stable properties that stand in relation of externality to one another. If we take the example of Karen Barad, for example, they argue that in reference to the concept of intra-action that they developed, they argue that, and I quote, to be entangled is not simply to be intertwined with one another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence. Existence is not an individual affair. Individuals do not pre-exist the interactions, rather individuals emerge through and as part of the entangled intra-relating, end quote. So this notion of entanglement complicates, of course, this idea of reconnection between humans and nature, since both humans and non-humans of nature gain meaning only in relation to one another. A relation is therefore not an encounter or a bridge between pre-established entities, but an enactment of being and knowing that is mutually constituted through the humans and non-humans implicated in this interaction at a particular moment across space and time. So in contrast to the usual interaction, then, which assumes separate individual agencies that precede each action, the notion of intra-action speaks to the impossibility of disentangling humans from non-human actions in the Andean cosmologies at stake here. In the EU Charter, in contrast, humans and non-humans as conceived as interdependent or interconnected. This inter points to a relation between pre-constituted entities, entities that are animated by separate individual agencies that precede each interaction among them. So at stake here is this sense of reconnection of humans and non-humans, rather than, or in contrast to, a reconfiguration of what it means to be human and non-human. Now, both theories of relationality reject a modernist sense of anthropocentrism, often associated to species hierarchy. Both also reject a sense of absolute separation between humans and non-humans. While on the one hand, the Andean cosmologies embrace an ontological monism, recognizing humans and non-human as intraconnected in their ways of being, knowing, and acting in the world, the EU Charter opts for an ontological dualism that views humans and nature as discrete, bounded, and autonomous entities. And both seem also to advocate for a form of legal pluralism, with the plurinational constitution of Ecuador and Bolivia, as well as the EU Charter, aiming for, and I quote again from the Charter, a radical transformation of current law through a new paradigm of relation between human beings and the rest of nature, therefore between human laws and laws of nature, end quote. Now, I want to conclude by stressing that my objective was never to critique the EU Charter for not integrating this ontological monism into its framework, akin to Andean cosmologies. Nor was it my intention to comparatively analyze different relational theories to determine which one is better or which one would work better with the concept of rights. Instead, I do not believe that theories of entangled agency could ever be translated into law, let alone into rights. More precisely, I don't believe that the legal form of rights and the subject of rights can accommodate entangled agency, which is far from saying that entangled agency cannot express normativity or something else. But how to translate this normativity into law remains an open question. And in this regard, I side with philosopher Frédéric Neyrat in calling for an ecology of separation, one that does not reinscribe the modernist split or cut between humans and non-humans, but promotes a distancing that is essential to act politically and legally according to an inclusive insight, which can only ever be meaningful in relation to an excluded outside. This is not an embrace of a flat ontology, and it's also not a succumbing to ecological holism. It is instead a reorientation of legal and political energy to this outside, always co-constituted by the inside, yet too often failing to be reckoned with. And again, going back to Karen Barad, as they insist, indeed, intra-active practices of engagement make the world intelligible in specific ways and foreclose other patterns of mattering. Therefore, accountability and responsibility must be thought of in terms of what matters and what is excluded from mattering, end quote. So rather than calling for more inclusion, more connections, more relations, by multiplying rights of nature, what if we would construe legal tactics and strategies that would foreground this exclusion that those enactments always perform? What if instead of constructing rights of nature as aimed at protecting what matters, effectively turning in, feeling out, sensing humans and non-humans, we would mobilize for legalities attuned to what is always and already excluded from mattering, not with the purpose of including the excluded, but with the purpose of undoing, instead of doing more with, the laws that structurally exclude from view oppressive relations between and among humans and non-humans. So I'll leave you with this open question for now, but I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Marie. So we have some time for questions now. So, yeah.
I have lots of
Please.
questions. That was great, and I was feeling super isolated. I'm trying to understand the whole thing, but I just feel the same thing, that when we try to justify the whole story using history, we are again relying on like human as essentiality. Like we are relying in a model of human, which is questionable, because it was always, as Dosina said, constructed by differentiation from other, right? So my question is directed more to how can we build material conditions for this whole thing, because I believe there will be no deconstruction of these laws in practice if we don't discuss, for example, in local places, how to redistribute land, for example. That's the case in Brazil, for example. We are discussing how to create instruments within constitutional law to include like indigenous ontologies, but we are not actually thinking that those ontologies would just be able to develop themselves into practices if they have space in the earth where they can explore it and grow it. And so I always have the tendency to go back to the point of like how we can do this if we don't have land. And I would love to listen this from you, because even Eduardo Castro, he's having a course right now on this, like what he's calling a radical colonialism, which would be like just ignoring the question of space and talking about metaphysical terms all the time, because that's what we're doing now, right? Like just talking about law in abstract terms and not associated to materiality directly.
Do we collect some questions?
Yeah, let's take one or two more, and
that was really awesome. So thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
I think I'm a little.
Sorry, I'm Luke from NSC. I'm one of the leads funders, so it's great to be back here. Been there anyway. I wanted to ask you about a couple of things that you didn't spend so much time talking about, such as institutions. So, for example, following up to that excellent question, what do you do in a situation where, if you put these different ontologies into constitutional law, who will be the decider? Right? Will it still be the Supreme Court, which is a very particular institution that will have a particular institutional knowledge and so on? And so maybe that's a question for Marie, and then for Costas, that was superb. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the modern concept of statelessness,
Status.
Whether you have any thoughts on that, because you made me think a lot about this difference between human and inhuman, and today in the statements, that's probably as close as you can be to be inhuman. So I wanted to ask you about that.
One more question? Anyone? Let's start with the 2 questions. So,
Roger, are you going?
Yes. Nice to see you.
Yeah, okay, because I had something to leave, but anyway. If you can say, I'll give you something.
You can give it maps. You can take a.
Sorry about that. We're all friends, we'll go back. 35 years, 40.
A long time.
Thanks for coming. Should we?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Isa.
Yeah, very, very nice. Yeah, I think you really put your finger on the difficulty that I sense in many ways as well. But so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to really answer your question, but perhaps I can say a little more how I came to this topic and my engagement with Barad and my way of navigating the work there, because essentially I'm more interested and currently working on this notion of the inhuman, and I got into the inhuman and trying to make sense, bridge the literature on the inhuman with legal literature and legal thinking in many ways. And this notion of the inhuman, I got to it and into it through a lot of reading and discussing works in critical Black studies, where there the inhuman is and I think there is a very explicit and important connection to be drawn with the work of Karen Barad when it comes to this radical state of ontological indeterminacy. And I think to me it helped a lot to make sense of Barad, reading through these very lived experience that's underpin the works in critical Black studies. I'm now generalizing just for the sake of the discussion, but it's very reductive, of course, in speaking in these terms. But how can we make sense of law and political, legal and political action from this notion of ontological indeterminacy? And again, you have lots of bridge to be built here with the literature on the post-human, which is what I'm doing in this chapter, thinking about rights of nature as a sort of post-human move that reconfigures or aims at reconfiguring the ontological grounding of the human and the non-human, of nature as such, etc. And where the inhuman really blurs all these categories. Yet thinking with works in critical Black studies, there is no ontological grounding for any politics and any social theory and any legal action at stake. It's really a sort of abyssal ontological positioning where there is a sort of refusal of the world as such. And what we are left with is often the figurative, aesthetic, speculative orientations that remain additive, that remain a multiplication of new worlds when we think about otherwise worlds, etc. There is already a reconfiguration of what should come next. And what I think in the work I'm familiar with in for example, some literature on the quilombismo, the Brazilian quilombismo, is really where I think there is exactly this bridge that is being built within this ontological indeterminacy and this sort of regrounding the political and legal action within the territorial struggles that often underpin lots of harms that are being resisted. And so I think that's actually really a fascinating question to ask. How is this maybe the way to conceptualize a politics of refusal that is really a strategy that brings law and politics not within a pre-existing frame of reference, but that reconfigures them in a radical way in order to still make a very concrete intervention within that frame by almost like blowing it up from the inside. So, I mean, yeah, I would love to hear more from you actually and from your project, because I think that's yeah, very much you might have actually better answers to that question than.
No, I don't have it, but I was just, it's the same thing, like, when we talk about the Anthropocene, I'm always like, we live in the capitalocene, that's the point, like, how can we make it real if we have actually the problem of the capital there, and if we don't like rethink it, there's no space, section of the earth where these things can happen.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, I fully agree, but I think it's indeed, if we think about these different ways of conceptualizing, you know, the Anthropocene, the capitalism, the Stuhlocene, or whatever, I think one important insight for me, and something that I really cling to, is that in many of these discursive tropes, there is a multiplication. We add new concepts, new subjectivities, new ontologies, new epistemologies, and we build, there is a sort of additive propensity at stake. And I think the inhuman actually allows us to refrain from this additive, this multiplication, this expansion, and to really invest the legal and political energy towards undoing what is there. And I think that is very useful. Now, the big question is, how do we undo these existing categories, these existing legal practices? And that relates me very briefly to Luke's question, because we still have to intervene. We need to act. I mean, it's again a sort of interaction from within the system when we need to position ourselves within them. So, Luke, to your question, when it comes to institutions, indeed, I think the positioning is different. I'm very influenced in my work by this notion that Jacques Vergès developed these strategies of rupture, where you can make an intervention within an institution, not with the point of claiming a recognition by that authority, by that institution, or being recognized in the eyes of that institution, but making an intervention, working with or within that institution in order, again, to disrupt it, to confront it with its inherent internal contradictions, and yeah, force it almost to reckon with its internal contradictions.
Yes, politics of rupture. We're totally together here. Politics of rupture. How we can have them more? I mean, Vergès has shown it, but it is a difficult question. Let me go back to the human, and human come back to that perhaps at the end, if I just thought anything that. Your question, in a sense, goes directly to chapter 12 of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. In that chapter, Hannah Arendt says, speaking about the stateless persons after the collapse of the empires, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Balkans, that lots of people, minority citizens who did not have a nation state in which they could have political rights, were wandering about in the Balkans, and nobody really wanted to touch them. So much they didn't want to touch them, they didn't even want to arrest them, so they were non-persons. And then Arendt adds, but of course that was the period in which what we had were minority rights, not human rights. It was before the Second World War, but it was the closest these people had, and our institutional establishments had, to human rights. And said those people were non-humans, but they had the human rights. And in that chapter, she also uses the term that has become very famous through George Agamben, that they were bare life, and they were biological life, but they didn't have any rights, although in theory they had rights. And again, Jacques Rancière's theory, in which Alexis's chapter depends so much on, and it's a great theory, again, is based on that idea of people who don't have rights, although they have rights. So let me take us a step back. The first declaration of what now we call human rights, was the French Declaration de Droits de l'Homme, in which it says, Article 1, all men, or just men, are born free and equal rights. And then in Articles 3 and various others, gives those universal rights that all men have in the world just to French nationals. So you have there a kind of clear gap between all the humans that have the rights and the French citizens who really have the rights. And of course, if you go into the history also, these are the French citizens who tend to be men with property, obviously white and all the rest of it. So what this gap between the human and the citizen, who inhabits that gap? And of course, it is the aliens, but specifically the stateless people. Because stateless people, aliens generally, do not have rights in a different country. And of course, stateless people do not have rights anywhere. So to that extent, in that kind of more logical analysis, they are the representatives of the non-human, or of what I call the anthropic. So we have there a clear understanding of rights that exist for all, but are given to some. And of course, these some may be different, not the French nationals, maybe the British nationals, it may be the heterosexuals or whatever. And between the grand humanity, as what I call the metaphysical conception of humanity, and the people who actually have the rights, who are men all to men, human all to human in the Nietzschean terms, exists, sort of perhaps the majority of the human population, who at some point or at all points have no rights that they're supposed to have. So the non-human there becomes, for me, the contradiction of the human, therefore the inhuman. Now, how can you respond to all these things? I mean, I totally agree with your chapter, with your conclusion, but I want to take it in a sense a step further. Perhaps not a step further, but I mean, to voice a slight concern. I called it indigenous, and compared it to Orientalism. We have a huge now literature developing, telling us what Latin American indigenous people and indigenous cultures and cosmologies, what they do in Ecuador, in Colombia. Of course, Oscar has written for many places. And the way it can start. I mean, the wonderful explanation of the entangled relationality in terms of cosmologies and cosmovisions of Latin American countries exists in our philosophical tradition in many ways. Let me mention one way in which I've been involved, I've written a lot. In the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas precisely says there is no I, which is not already a you. That the other is already in me, and I am already in the other. You could go even further back and use the recognition theories and so on. But that does not change the fact that the ontology of capitalist modernity we live in does not accept that entirely. Of course, it accepts to the extent that all morality, in a sense, is involved in that, or proper morality, not Kantian morality of imperatives and norms and rules, but the morality of love, of care, of solidarity, what people sort of do when they go to help the refugees or the migrants that come in and so on, and they sort of risk their lives. I mean, that is a morality of indeed entangled relationality, although we would not use necessarily those terms, and Levinas's ideas would be dismissed out of court by the standard moral philosopher of today. Does that help us to change the orthodox ontologies and ways of thinking? I'm afraid not. I mean, sort of many of us have been talking about these things, not through cosmovision, but no, through Western philosophical shows, and clearly, we have not gone very far. And to that extent, an answer to your question is, if I understood it correctly, and that's what I was trying to do in my talk, let us separate, for the time being, the laws, the legal remedies, the legal ways in which we can get some land for the landless, we can develop, sort of certain tools for which, so we can help people. And of course, those wider questions of an entangled relationality and of an ontology of being with the other. Now, we think of Jean-Luc Nancy, the idea of being with the other is part of who I am. There are lots of philosophical traditions in the West that have similar ideas, but they have not taken root, and the law cannot really introduce them because the law, a modern law, whether capitalist or not, it's all capitalist, but basically it is based on the idea that human beings are individuals, they are self-contained units, and therefore my relationship with Oscar or with you, Marie, is always an external relation. It is an interaction, but not an interaction. That is what the law is doing in Western capitalism. And to that extent, because I want raptures, I need to play with those possibilities that the law gives us, as Versailles was doing, without any great optimism. But this is what sort of we can do. I mean, we can do our ontologizing, our philosophizing, talk about togetherness, entanglement, and so on. But in terms of helping people and helping us, I think the law and the political route gives us small possibilities to start changing the balance of power. Not huge, nobody is particularly optimistic, but this is where sort of we have to work, to forget occasionally our philosophizing, talking about myself, I do it all the time, and get out and do a few things by using legal tools.
Oscar?
Two things. Number one, Mary, thanks for your chapter, which I read very carefully for two reasons. Number one, because I love Karen Barad, and you helped me understanding her better. Number two, because of this very interesting reading of what the European Union is trying to do with Andean cosmologies. So thank you, and two observations. Number one, this is not the first time, of course, that the European polity, legal political order is trying to do things with other people's philosophies and cosmologies. This is exactly the way in which both coloniality and capitalism operate, and have done so from the outset, 1492. In fact, if we look at how the Spanish Empire solved the problem of money, currency, metals, it is precisely by using a variation on Aristotle, which gave matter vibrant qualities, thereby including the cosmology of Andean peoples to come up with this wonderful idea according to which metals, that is to say currency, begets currency. We're all familiar with that, particularly if we read volume 3 of Marx's Capital. It's a good idea to go beyond volume 1. But that's opposite to my question. My question is a very simple one. I totally agree with you and with Costa that additive strategies do not do the work. More worlds and so on and so forth. In fact, that was the very debate within the decolonial group between those of us who remain in alliance with political economy and those like Walter and others who went on their culturalist jive and whatever that was. So the question is, if additive tactics do not work, and what we need to do is to appeal to legal, political, ruptural strategies, diplomacy, as per my chapter, sorry for this multiplicity, what would be the mathematical operation that is equivalent to a legal strange rupture if it is not addition? What would be the equivalent? Evaluators has a pretty good idea about that, but
So
Yeah, I mean,
we have two more questions in the chat, so maybe I can read them and we can try to answer all three together. So the first question from Tony says, I would love to hear if you could articulate somewhat more in detail what is the paradigm of the person that functions at the heart of the debate. So we know that in Roman law, this person was the paterfamilias, later on the white able-bodied man, but what is it at present? A Western dude like me? Okay, so we know you are white, no? Yeah, actually I know Tony, so I know that he's white. So I think, so the second question says, I think we need to pass from a human rights legal culture to a global, all beings right legal culture. It is essential for the well-being of the planet. My question is how legal communities will come to find solutions in rights conflicts between humans and non-humans in favor of non-humans, and in what situations would that be possible? So I think, yeah.
Alex, you've written about the person quite a lot, so why don't you answer?
Yeah, I can answer, Tony, but maybe you want to answer the
mathematics.
yeah. Or you, Maria.
no, I would love to hear more from Isa.
Well, Isa then.
Or you, Oscar. I mean, you pointed out Isa.
The equation, the subject is an X. All the things around are also X. I mean, it's but I mean, if we want to go into this, I think we have to dissolve everything because it's everything contingent, right? And I mean, I'm getting to this point now. We cannot say that there is something we can predict about this encountering between human beings, so to say, and things out there. It is always random the type of ontology that will be viewed out in this encountering. So maybe that's why I'm struggling with the material conditions of giving. Maybe I'm going to end up in anarchism because that's the point. If we want to find something in between us that is communal, which is not epistemic, we'll have to find these characteristics in things, maybe, and give things more power than our perceptions of them. So
Okay, then it's not addition, but it is division and multiplication. Divide entities, human and non-human entities, and then multiply by coming out to this contingent, as you said, contingent interrelationship, entangled interrelationship, being together and so on. So you don't add, because when you add, except nominalism, Descartes said that God can say 2 and 2 is 5, and they still say it today. But when you add, you assume that the entities come fully formed, and therefore they are added one or the other. By dividing and multiplying, then I don't know whether this is my to Oscar's question. I mean, I'm sure you have the answer, and that's why you asked a hard question.
I don't have the answer, but there are at least two proposals on the table. One coming from the anthropologists, and in a sense, this is a call for us lawyers and philosophers to engage fully with the anthropologists who who enter into alliances with certain groups, and also the mathematicians. The anthropologists, Eduardo Riveros de Castro has a beautiful little essay called a mathematical meta-fantasy on the square root of dual organizations. The references, of course, to Levi-Strauss on institutions. And he says, yes, of course, divide, of course, division. But of course, the radical division is a square, it's the square root, because it's an infinitesimal division. He is trying to explain in this way the cosmovision of low Amazonian groups, which is different from Andean cosmovisions. And those distinctions matter a lot, particularly when we're trying to resolve the issue of the Marcasão in Brazil, or, and this is the other thing, as in our experience of 30 years accompanying native peasant community in northwestern Colombia, using legal tools for 30 years. And of course, what we have come up with are ways in which the indigenous communities assert their self-determination in non-state ways. This resonates with the question of statelessness. Two examples, the 2013 Constitution of the White Earth Nation, a group that lives in between Canada and what is now Canada and the United States. They use ruptural tactics, but the tactic that seems the other tactic on the table is the other mathematical operation is derivation, which is what financial engineers use to put a price on assets, on options. Now, you can try a historical claim by a non-human, that is to say, a dehumanized group, as if it were an option. This is important because it solves all the usual questions that the Nigel Farages of this world ask when you say the word reparations. So it keeps, you can actually value it. And if you treat it as an option, you can price it as a derivative. So perhaps it is time for us lawyers to educate ourselves on finance and mathematics and propose these kinds of remedies to courts and to also other institutions. In the case of the conflict, the civil war, the land-based civil war in Colombia, we came to the conclusion that the institutions that existed, namely our Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, and so on and so forth, were not going to get us anywhere. And so when we negotiated the 2016 peace accords, this other institution was invented, which is now operating, the special peace jurisdiction. Its main task is to redesign new remedies for conflicts. And so rather than, for instance, extending notions of rights to nature, it declared certain ecosystems a victim of war. When you do that, you can create remedies and price them using derivations, and you can create, for instance, a trust that can be used by a community on a plot of land to live their life in whichever way they.
I totally agree with you. I mean, this is what I call anthropic law or anthropic legal remedies. In other words, legal remedies that don't go through rights, because rights have the individual's right into their heart.
Which is probably the answer to the second question.
Yeah.
No, not in that way.
Yeah.
Rights
So
will not get us.
so we can talk about different types of legal remedies, which are called anthropic, for anthropic entities, for non-human entities. What I want really to and keep insisting is that humanity comes with a very big baggage. And the main baggage is the inhuman. Humanity speaks the inhuman. Humanity is always created against the background of inhumanity. And in that sense, I'm saying that, sort of human rights and the human are not appropriate for the kinds of issues that this book discusses.
Yeah. I mean,
No,
I think the same. I think we, for example, queer theory is dismantling the binary thing between female and male in the same logic. So we should maybe talk about beings in general, like maybe or entities, but not humans anymore.
So what are the questions?
Can I just add to that? Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah. Because I think, I mean, it's I'm fully on board with what you are both saying, but I think that we run into problems again. We run into the certain, well, because precisely what the drive of like legal anthropologists, again, without essentializing them and the objectives here, but there is already an assumption that the world is graspable, that there is an accessibility to the world that is on offer somehow, you know, and this is a bit the role of the legal anthropologist in many ways. But if we work, and the example that you take with reparations, this is now a big thing, and there is already, I mean, it's already completely co-opted with this liberal rights-based approach to reparations. And coming back to this mathematical formula that you asked about, it had me thinking about the work, and I'm sure you're familiar with the book, but Unpayable Debt by Denise Ferreira de Silva, who works really with these mathematical formulas of subtraction instead of addition, with this infinitum, this infinite, that is a corpus infinitum that cannot be, that's, you know, but it's, Oh, I'm definitely going to take the training in math and finance that you will offer at law school here soon. But what I want to the reason why, indeed, I'm absolutely not someone who works with has a mathematical brain, but where Da Silva is really useful to me is that she also makes this distinction between the non and the not. The not being always determined, it's an opposition, coming back to what you, Costas, were saying at first. It demands a determination. It demands to determine what we are opposed to. And she suggests working with the non, which is infinitely open. It's this radical alterity that cannot and can never be subsumed into any liberal rights frame, into any liberal understanding of reparations. That's why the book is called Unpayable Debt. It's an invitation to think with the irreparable.
You pay what not be paid.
Yeah, exactly. But this is where we end up with collective socialities, modes of being together and becoming together that claim redistribution, that claim an unsettling and dismantling of the institutions and the legal categories and practices on which they rest. So this is, to me, a very meaningful example of subtraction rather than addition, of the non rather than the not, of the open radicality, the radical openness instead of the determination.
Totally agree. I mean, I do believe Denise is a very good reader, like many Brazilian theories. I mean, I do believe that we do have something new to learn from people like her or Jean Tible in Brazil. I mean, these guys, this is not a coincidence. They have been very well schooled by pretty good years, decades of good anthropological work, and also struggle. This is where we come from, you know?
And because we are here really speaking indeed about like very high levels of abstraction, I think it's really important to turn to these struggles. And it can be, and I think Denise Ferreira de Silva does it very well, where I think she enables us at least to work with these conceptual moves and translate them into concrete strategies of disruption, of rupture, of struggles in relation to the land. But it can also be as simple as like just refusing further datification, further turns to sensing technologies that always assume this graspability, this access, this multiplication of the understanding of the ecologies, the living ecologies that we entangled within, and instead redraw somehow, you know, and this is maybe the best.
It's not graspable. I mean, any scientist knows that. It's what can become next.
Alex?
Just very briefly, 2 points about the issue of entities and the issue of reparations as well. So in terms of if it's starting just entities or just being, one of the problems that we have is we end up with flat ontologies, you know, everything is the same. And we need some sort of distinction, as Nelgat says very well. We need to pay attention to that outside, otherwise, you know, it's just this, what we have, you know. And usually these flat ontologies doesn't work to in a way of hierarchizing, giving more hierarchy to what is now, which is excluded, which is now considered as what is not considered, let's say, a person or a human being. but it usually works the other way around. You end up with a hierarchy in which you have the human being, and now all these incorporated new beings, no human beings that are now considered human. But the hierarchy is still the same, because the main standard which defines that hierarchy is a human being and the characteristics of a human being. With this, I'm more or less responding as well to Tony's questions about who is a human being. Yes, it's you, the white you. It's you, Tony. No, it is still the human being. It is still the human person. Because, and this is very clear in the discussions, in the judgments, in the case law, in the legislation, because the main criteria used to consider no human beings as holders of rights or subjects of rights is, to possess the inner characteristics that have been usually assigned to human beings, such as, for example, sensitivity, intelligence, reason. If we go to the Middle Ages, is the soul. The old time discussion about the indigenous people in the Valladolid debates. They were discussing whether indigenous peoples have souls or not, because the soul, what we now call the mind, defines what is human, what is worthy, what is the person, what is a legal person or the legal subject. So, I believe that we are still, this is more or less like an expansion, a kind of humanism 2.0, rather than something new. However, as I said in the introduction, there are also some possibilities. You have a field to create some ruptures, because you are looking as well, you are trying to bring this outside in a way inside. The problem and the discussion we should have is how you do that kind of incorporation. If you produce still, again, another form of exclusion, the inclusion that we have now, or if you, find a different mean, to do that. And in terms of reparations, it's the other big discussion we have. But the problem with reparations is more or less the same problem that we have with rights. Reparations started as part of the transitional justice discourse, are still quite liberal. The very idea of reparations, not only they arrive late, and in terms of, for example, in terms of the environmental issues, that is very problematic, because we cannot arrive later. We cannot just provide, let's say, a fix to it. We need to go ahead. But yeah, we are very late. We are very late. That's true. But that's what we need, to change the strategy, right? We cannot, think just about reparations, because we are just going to arrive late. But also reparations are quite, liberal in many ways. The very idea of reparations is very liberal. And there is a question there whether reparations can actually produce a transformative politics or not. I'm not very optimistic, but it's the same with rights. We have a minimal chance to produce some sort of rupture, but the general landscape, does not help us to be very optimistic with reparations or with rights, with extension of rights. And Costas, I totally agree with you in the sense that the framework of human rights is not very helpful here. But actually, this is what people is trying to impose here, right? It's just an extension.
Based also on that confusion between legal rights and human rights, that they're taking us absolutely the same, identical. And
Exactly, it's just a mere extension of human rights.
The moral deficit, the moral lack in legal rights that became absolutely clear and positive. And then in the Nuremberg trials, when the Nazis say, I followed the law, they made absolutely clear that the positivistic view of law is totally amoral or immoral in many cases.
Exactly. So I think that on that note, considering the time, we can maybe finish here. So thank you all for being here. For your
Online.
yeah, also to you guys online, thank you for your questions and for being here. So we have a fantastic wine reception. I have to thank so many people before, so please let me thank people. So I have to thank the Forum on the Centering the Human and the Queen Mary Center for International Law for supporting this event and for this fantastic wine reception. I also have to thank QM's events team, Wulsh, here, for team for supporting us today. And also, I have to thank the contributors to the volume, Marie, Costas, Oscar here, many others who actually made this volume possible. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.